Welcome to the 6th section of the Ethics in Education module for EDN 3200. We've laid some solid foundations now for thinking about ethics in general and education in particular. And we've also got a sense of how sticky ethics can be, and that codes and rules, they're not going to always give us the answer. Now we're going to look at some dilemmas and situations where we need to think carefully through the ethics of what is going on and what we might do. And in some of these situations, what needs to be done is relatively obvious. In others, not so much. We'll need to deploy the tools we've built up this far to analyze those situations and make decisions. Let's do a quick recap of what tools we've built into this toolbox we've got. In section 1, we looked at meta-ethics and we noticed that we have different ways of justifying what we believe. It might be based on spirituality, it might be based on reason or on social consensus. We saw that our beliefs might have particular properties, such as being based on absolute values versus contingent ones. They might be based on the principle of the issue or on the outcome that we want to achieve. There might be a focus on the good of the individual or the good of the collective. And having different ideals of what good means can depend on what types of time horizons we're thinking on. In section 2, we then looked at how ethics relates to being social beings, and that having sociological imagination and an historical awareness would help us to make more nuanced decisions about what is good and right. We explored the dichotomy of monism versus pluralism. Just to remind you, monism was that school of thought that posited that if we all just deploy reason and logic, we'll all eventually get to the same answer about what is good and right. And that this was a very rationalist or Enlightenment type of ethics. Pluralism, by contrast, argued that we could all use reason and yet arrive at some very different ideas about what is good and right, and that would depend on our cultural and life experience context. In section 3, we then explored Christie's paper where she outlined the idea of an ethical imagination. Christie argued that teachers have a responsibility to develop ethical imagination in themselves and their students, and that this imagination included 3 clear criteria: the intellectual rigor of our practice, public engagement, and an ethics of care. In section 4, we tackled that tricky Bista paper that took us down some rabbit holes regarding what being moral actually entails. We looked at the differences between accountability versus responsibility. And we also explored the idea that codes and rules cannot tell us what the right thing is. He said that when we yield to codes, or what he called socialization, or to the emotion of the crowd, what he called sociality, we won't be guided on the real right thing to do in a moment. Rather, we need to deploy moral conscience as an autonomous and quite lonely practice. Bista argues that teachers and education practitioners in general live in an era of accountability, which has stripped education of ethics in favor of rule following. And ironically, rule following does not necessarily yield more ethical or moral behavior, but may actually inhibit it. And he also made the point that if you're confused, it's probably because you're not following rules, but you're actually thinking. Finally, in section 5, we've looked at the SACE Code of Conduct, and we've picked it apart a bit. We noticed some vague statements could mean almost anything, and that there were also some contradictions and generalized statements which would, in practice, be very difficult to enforce. We discussed how the code is more of a legal or bureaucratic framework than necessarily a guide on how to be an ethical teacher. So where do we go with all this? In today's section, I'm going to present you with 5 situations. I will outline the details of each scenario, and then I'll encourage you to pause and think through what you would do in the situation before continuing on to the discussion. Are you ready? Here we go. Scenario number 1. It's a Tuesday morning somewhere in May. You've got a rowdy grade 8 maths class first thing in the morning, and it's really not your favourite day of the timetable. After managing to get the group into the classroom, settled into their desks, you decide to try and engage one of the most challenging characters in the class early in the lesson because you want to try and get them on board. Now here's a little bit of background about this particular student. Unfortunately, they're extremely academically weak and have been scoring less than 20% since the beginning of the year on all their assessments. Discussions in the staff room with colleagues reveal that the student is not only challenging in the maths class, but across the board. The student's family situation is really not great. They live in a shack with 5 siblings and their parents. Their mom works as a traditional healer, but work is thin on the ground. Their father works as a construction worker, but has a problem with drinking a bit heavily and has a bit of a nasty temper. The student is overage for grade 8 and is already 16 years old. They've repeated each phase since foundation phase. All the staff know the student does use marijuana and suspect that they also sell it. They unfortunately often get into conflict with other students and have been caught hurting them or swearing at them. However, you do know that the student has a softer side. Having visited their home, you've realized they're a really talented artist. They make impressive clay art. And they've also got a penchant for adopting and looking after the stray dogs in the area. They've just taken home a cute puppy, and they're really doting on it with affection and care. The student was also in a confrontation with the principal at the beginning of the year over their dreadlocks, and the principal insisted they had to be cut off to stick with the school's uniform code. As a teacher, you felt this was wrong, because the student's hair is part of their traditional beliefs. And since then, understandably, the student has been at odds with the leadership of the school, feeling very angry. Overall, this particular student has earned a reputation for being troublesome, some of which is deserved, and some of which is not. And so on this Tuesday morning, you want to engage them early on, and you want to try and make some learning progress and forge a more positive connection based on a sense of achievement. To do this, you ask this particular student to read a paragraph from the textbook aloud to the class to get the lesson going, while you write the lesson objectives on the board. You reason to yourself that it's a pretty low bar task, it doesn't involve them getting a question right or wrong, and it will give you a chance to thank them for their contribution. Your request is greeted with silence. You turn around from the board to see what is causing the unusual quiet. This is normally a loud and very confident student. And you see them sitting and staring at the book with their eyes wide, frozen still. You gently encourage them. Have you managed to find the right paragraph? It starts with a polynomial. It's about halfway down the page. Silence. And then you realize the student cannot read. What are the ethical dilemmas here? The scenario already sets up some of the complexities of the student's relationship with the school, including their hair situation, the bullying issues, disruptions in classes, and the use and trade of substances. Also, the student is not just a bad apple. They're creative and artistic. They care for vulnerable creatures. So you've inadvertently and accidentally exposed a deep-seated insecurity for this person in front of the whole class. What do you do? What do you do in the moment? What do you do beyond the specific lesson? Take a moment to pause here and think through these things before moving on to the next slide. Okay, this is clearly not a great situation. In trying to do the right thing, you've ended up putting a very vulnerable student in a situation of seriously losing face in front of their classmates. And for this student in particular, this could be a huge source of shame, which is a problem because most of their bravado and bullying behavior towards other students is driven by shame and deep insecurity. What types of beliefs might feed into how you respond? I would argue that the following influence my own response. I believe, as an absolute belief that is beyond question, that the student deserves the opportunity to learn, even if they're not the most easy or compliant to get along with. I think as well that I have a belief that the student's inability to read is not their fault. I'm drawing on my own sociological imagination and awareness about the nature of education opportunities in primary schools, especially the type of primary school where I knew this student attended. I also am using my knowledge of his home situation and how his personal troubles might relate to broader social trends. Thirdly, an ethics of care makes me suspect that perhaps the student is an undiagnosed dyslexic. And I'm also drawing here on my experience as a teacher and trying to adhere to that part of the code of conduct which says I keep up with developments in my field and I broaden my knowledge about teaching and learning. And if this is the case, then my duty of care to him as both an adult and a professional educator must extend to establishing if this is the case and getting him the requisite support if I can. Now, it would seem that there is actually quite a nice synergy here between what's good and right for this student as an individual and what's good and right for the group at large. If the student can be helped with their literacy issues, this will clearly have an effect on their ability to engage at school with lessons, and it will probably decrease the disruptive behaviour that affects other people. However, having said which, there was a trade-off in this particular situation, where students like this one unfortunately can consume an inordinate amount of teachers' time and energy, and thereby deprive other students of attention and input. In an ideal world, there would be a school counsellor, an education psychologist, and a remedial teacher who would deal with cases like this to allow the mainstream teachers to focus on the rest of their class. However, this is just not the reality in most South African schools. And so a balance somehow needs to be struck between competing demands on the teacher's effort and time to help the individual versus still keep attention on the rest of the group. What are some of the potential actions that we might consider here? We'll think about what one does immediately in the moment, as well as after the lesson. In the moment, you could try and downplay the situation by simply saying, oh, okay, student X is still clearly waking up, and that's all right, me too, I'm also sleepy this morning. Student Y, would you mind reading aloud for us, please? This obviously doesn't address the issue in the moment, but it may allow your student to save face. You could also give the student a get out of jail free card via a fictitious errand. Student X, oh my gosh, I realized I forgot my photocopies at the office. Won't you please run and ask Miss for them and bring them back to me? It still doesn't solve the issue, but you're giving the student a timeout and a way to escape the sense of shame they may be feeling. However, given how the student responds to shame or feeling bad, perhaps letting them out of your sight right now to go about the school on their own is not such a good idea. You could encourage them to keep trying, even if they don't manage to read the paragraph. I'm not sure this would be very productive in the moment, though. The emotional barriers the student might be feeling are probably too high to make forging forward with the original task meaningful or helpful. The real action needs to happen after the lesson. You would need to draw in colleagues and leadership. Flag up to senior members of staff what has happened, because this literacy problem is not unique to your lesson, and it requires a coordinated response across the staff. You would also need to try and get support from beyond the school, and get those with authority to control to deploy the necessary resources if they can. For example, the district education psychologist needs to come and do an evaluation. There's also a whole lot of bureaucratic procedures that need to kick in, like filling in evaluation request forms, making notes on the student's record, trying to get hold of the student's past reports if you can get them. And some of these are about getting resources and mobilizing systems to do so. And some of them are about creating a paper trail to demonstrate that you did act when you discovered the issue. So this is a blend of ethics and legalese. You probably would also want to try and coordinate with the language teachers about a program to support the student to learn and read appropriately. You might, as a team, identify a member of staff who has a good relationship with the student, someone who could sit down with them, talk to them about the difficult issue, try and understand how the student feels, and also ask them what they want to do moving forward. In this situation, it is extremely difficult to know what needs to be ethically done for the student. Unfortunately, while the teachers knew what needed to be done, the resources just weren't available. The education psychologist took 3 months to make an appointment. The student was meantime suspended more than once for problematic behaviour, despite frequent chats with them and attempts to support them. Remedial interventions were not possible, as there was only one member of staff free at any given time, and there was no way of giving the student the one-on-one support they needed. One teacher attempted to start a pen-pal diary with the student to give them a safe space to try and put pen on paper or to read together during break time. But this was erratic and difficult to sustain on top of normal lessons. The main question from this scenario is, what does it mean to do the right thing, given the limited power of ordinary teachers in the face of grave systemic inequalities and the gross under-resourcing of most schools? Scenario number 2. A student arrives in your class with a severely bruised face. This is the 5th period of the day, and that means that the teachers have seen them already. No one has said anything in the staff room, and a memo hasn't been circulated. So once the class is settled and working, you quietly approach their desk and whisper, "Has someone already spoken to you about what's happened?" They answer, "No." You then ask the student to accompany you out of the classroom. You want to have this conversation away from an audience, and you ask them what happened. The student discloses that their mother came home very intoxicated the night before and was very angry, and that they were beaten in a bit of a drunken rage. Further inquiry about the student's home life reveals that they are 15 and live with their 31-year-old mother, 7-year-old younger sister, and baby brother of age 1. They all live in a single-room house. The mother's income is the only one in the household, and she's earning very little. The student does not want to be taken to a place of safety, despite their injuries. They fear for their younger siblings. What do you do? The bureaucratic response to this is very straightforward. Out comes the Form 22. But when you call the allocated social worker for the school, you can't get through. And it is clear that a bureaucratic response is not necessarily an ethical one in this case. The strict procedure says that the student should be taken to a safe house in a faraway suburb where they know no one. They would not come to school to see their friends or teachers who know them best, since this is a risk for their mother coming to school to reclaim them. And their concerns about their younger siblings is not invalid. So unless the social work system is able to rapidly place all 3 children in a situation of safety, which they weren't for lack of spaces in safe houses, and of course a 1-year-old is a tricky situation, well then what is the ethical response? There's clearly an outcomes-based type of orientation here. What you want is the best outcome for the student. Whether whisking them away is the best thing to do or not depends on how that plays out for that student. Foster care and state guardianship is notorious for not effecting appropriate protection for vulnerable children. So pause for a moment to think on what you would do in this situation. Try also to deploy your ethics of care and your sociological imagination. What is the situation of the mother? Is there some way perhaps of supporting her to be a better guardian? And is that compatible with holding her responsible for what she's done? What about the student's expressed wish to not leave? At almost 16, they're perfectly capable of making their own wishes known. Scenario number 3. The principal calls you into his office and insists that your wardrobe is unprofessional because you have a nose piercing. He insists you must take it out when you are at school, as it's against the staff dress code. You say you do not wish to take it out because it is still healing and removing it will mean the piercing will close. You decide to mount a defense to the principal to argue your case. You say that you feel the dress code is overly conservative, does not reflect changing times. You also point out that it was not in place when you took the job, and that you did not consent to its imposition on you. You also point out to the principal that your nose piercing does not affect the student's respect for you or your ability to do your job, and that differentiating between nose piercings and other piercings, for example the ears, does seem a little arbitrary and without merit. Finally, you point out to him that actually there is a benefit to the nose piercing. On many occasions, it has facilitated a healthy, open conversation with students who are thinking about piercings of their own. You said that it has allowed students to approach you to ask for advice, and you to counsel them sincerely and authentically regarding the merits of and dangers of body piercings. But the principal remains unmoved and threatens you with a disciplinary if you fail to remove it. What do you do? Well, there are a few things we could consider here. The chances are you will only just get a caution or warning if you stand your ground and you insist on not taking it out. This is not an offence for which you'll get fired. But rather, it's a case of whether this is a battle you want to pick, and how hard the principal could make your life, and on what grounds you have decided to argue with him. For example, if you wear the ring for religious reasons, then his insistence you remove it is unconstitutional, and you could take it up from this angle. But otherwise, the issue sits somewhere between the space of the school's regulations and your individual freedom of expression. So it really depends on how much appetite you have for a conflict. As an ethical issue, this mostly seems to be one about an individual and your own sense of what is right and good for you. However, you might feel that this instruction on the part of the principal constitutes an overreach of power, and you might fight it on that reason, rather than on the specific issue of nose rings per se. For example, you argue there's a collective good that might result from your resistance, wherein the line of authority between staff and principal is more appropriately drawn. This framing would also imply an outcomes-oriented decision. You're premising this on the absolute principle of resisting excessive authoritarian power where you find it. Perhaps you believe that no one should have the right to tell anyone else what they can and can't wear. This brings up some interesting questions about school uniform, doesn't it? Scenario number 4. You're sitting in a moderation meeting and have to present some unfortunately dismal results for the end of year assessment, which most of your students failed. The IMG manager tells you that your school's marks are not politically acceptable. They tell you to find some marks in order to boost the pass rate so that fewer students are retained in the grade. You object. You say that this totally nullifies the validity of the assessment grades and that it's unethical for a teacher who must uphold the truthfulness of assessments, not only for their students but for their caregivers and the general public. What do marks mean if they are adjusted when they're inconvenient? The IMG manager, however, responds that the system will collapse if 80% of students keep missing the pass criteria of every grade, and that students must move through the system if chaos is to be avoided. Now, you know that when your students arrived in your class, they were already 2 or 3 grades worth of learning behind. And you also know that most of them have made progress throughout the year, even if they're unable to meet the specific criteria for the grade in which they're registered. You argue that the progress should form a greater component of the student's assessment, rather than a standardized assessment pegged at the grade level. But you also know that your arguments will not change the large system of which you are a part, even if you think it should change. You also know that if so many students are being kept behind, there will be insufficient space in the class for the new students coming into the grade. So what do you do? This specific dilemma really gets at the relations of power between individual teachers and the massive machine that is the education system, especially with standardized curriculum, standardized testing, and a set pace at which learners must move through the grade, for fear the whole machine will come crashing down to a halt. We're going to look at this again in the next section about the pandemic and the loss of the academic year. The decision will also have implications for other students and colleagues, whether at this school or another school. These students who are passed through to the next grade will not necessarily be ready for the material there. Future students who then need to move into the grade will not have adequate space. Other teachers will be then receiving students who are not prepared for the material the teacher needs to teach them. They'll have to work with students who are still trying to cover curriculum that should have been covered in previous years, and it will intensify their teaching load a lot. And of course, it also has implications for the integrity of the system. The sharpest tension on this dilemma is the principle versus the outcome. Different interests are in contradiction with each other. What might be ethical by the profession might not be ethical for the incoming students. What might be ethical for you will have serious impact on other colleagues. It's a proper dilemma. Really, it's a dilemma generated by the fact that fixing the issue of students not learning at the assessment stage is way too late. Scenario 5. A member of staff has been arriving at school early in the morning and is clearly intoxicated. You're the only one noticing because you get there to school earlier than most. You know that they are the primary breadwinner in their household, and that if they lose their job, their whole family will suffer. And for now, it doesn't seem that their inebriation is affecting their work too much, but it is still a concern that they're intoxicated on the job. In addition, they also have a set of master keys for the school property, and should they lose these carelessly because of their state, it would have real implications for the school's security. What do you do? Clearly, the situation with this colleague is not sustainable. The question rather is whether the relevant leadership of the school will respond in a heavy-handed manner and throw the rule book at the person, or whether the issue will be approached with a rehabilitative or supportive attitude. Will you throw the rule book at them, or will you give them rehab and support? An ethics of care requires understanding that alcohol dependence is a medical condition and one that is exacerbated by socioeconomic circumstances. It's not really a personal vice or failing. But it's also not helpful to be naive about alcohol dependency and its effects on people's memories, health, attentiveness, reflexes, and dependability. Perhaps thinking this dilemma through requires considering 2 scenarios. One, where there is supportive leadership who would assist the person in getting counseling and therapy, and the other, where there is punitive leadership, who would suspend or fire the person with no alternatives. What might be ethical would be different in each of these two scenarios. Remember the warning at the beginning of section 1. This module is going to give you more questions than answers. And we've looked at 5 scenarios in this section, which relates to ethics in multiple ways. The answers to the question, what is the right thing to do, have been far from clear in each of them, although the principles that might guide us in deciding have been easier to discern in some than in others. Confession time. None of these situations are fictional. They've all happened. I've drawn them from my personal experience as a teacher in many schools. I feel they reflect a myriad of ethical dilemmas, from systemic issues regarding assessment, minor conflicts about nose rings, students in abusive situations at home, students who've been failed by the system, and colleagues not bringing their best selves to school. It's hopefully clear by now what my beef is with the statement in the SACE Code of Conduct about the quality of education in the system being dependent on teachers' attitudes and commitment. That statement ignores serious structural issues that inhibit teachers from effecting quality teaching and learning for their students. And it's often these structural issues that generate contradictions and compromises, wherein the good of some comes at the price of the good of others. Nowhere has this become more apparent than in this moment of the pandemic. We'll look at this in the next section. In this section, we've explored 5 ethical scenarios based on real-life experience. We've used some of the tools from the previous sections to reflect on dilemmas and think through the types of action that would affect the most good. We've explored how actions are limited by context and constraints, and how sometimes doing the right thing for one group of people harms another group. In the next section, we'll explore how these tensions are amplified in the pandemic moment. Well done for making it through to the end of this section, and happy Pride Month.